Question. You mentioned the hallmarks of the fallen beings at relative length, and to some extent avatars. But what are the hallmarks of the original inhabitants of the earth? Well, so in order to understand this, you have to understand what I've explained in my video on how the world was created. That there were original inhabitants that were created by the spiritual beings, by the ascended masters, to take embodiment specifically on earth after the earth was created. And then there are some beings who have come here later when the earth entered a downward spiral. There were fallen beings that were allowed to embody here in order to break up the conformity of earth. And then there were avatars that embodied here from natural planets in order to balance the fallen beings, basically. So when you understand this, then the question is, what are the characteristics of the original inhabitants? And the main characteristics is that they're very tied to earth. They're very, we might say, attached to earth. And this usually is seen by they're very attached to where they were born and where they grew up. Obviously there are different ranges of consciousness. I mean, there are some that can still be quite aggressive, but there are many people, especially in the democratic world, who have reached a higher level where they are not aggressive. They have basically embodied Jesus' teachings about turning the other cheek. And so they're what you would call good people. I look at the people I grew up with. They're all what I would call good people. But they were born in this little town in Denmark. They have lived their whole lives in this little town in Denmark. They are going to die there and they're going to be buried there. I mean, the thought of moving 20 kilometers away to another town to find a job didn't occur to most of them. So this is one characteristic. You see it around the world. Many people who were born in a certain place, they are so identified with that place. It may not even be the country they are born in. It may be this little village, this little town. And they can't conceive of living anywhere else. And it's not all the earthly beings that are like this, but many of them are. They're very tied to their birthplace. And of course, beyond that, they're very tied to earth. You can also see that quite often, they are not as open to a spiritual teaching as most spiritual people are. Many spiritual people are avatars. And, if you understand what I've explained in my other video about how the world was created and some of the other videos in that series, there came this turning point where the original inhabitants of the earth had created this very uniform society. Very conformist society. And the problem with that is that the entire universe is constantly expanding or self-transcending, growing. And so what they had created was a society that resisted growth, because in order to create what they considered harmony and peace, they had tried to eradicate all creative differences, all creativity basically. And there is a law that guides the physical universe. It's part of the whole free will complex of laws that says that if something isn't growing, it must deteriorate. In other words, nothing can stand still at a certain level indefinitely. And it's actually described in the scientific principle called the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics basically says that in a closed system, entropy will increase. Entropy means disorder, meaning things will break down. So you take a typical example, a steam locomotive. You have a boiler where there's water and there's coal being shoved in there, and this creates heat and this creates steam and this can do work. But if you stop shoveling coal into it, then obviously the temperature is going to fall until it's the same temperature as the environment and no work can be performed. If you don't maintain it, it will gradually rust and it'll simply deteriorate until it's no longer there. It's fallen into the earth, basically. So this is what was happening on Earth. Because people were not really wanting to be creative, not really wanting to make decisions, not really wanting to consider better ways of doing things. And this is another characteristic you see on the original Earth inhabitants. I can think back of family members that lived in the same apartment for 40 years with the same furniture. Never changed anything, the same pictures on the wall, for 40 years. And I couldn't conceive of that. And most avatars couldn't conceive of that, because you want something new, you want something changed, this or that. But many of the Earth's inhabitants, they are completely happy. They have a certain lifestyle, and they just want to live that way for the rest of their lives. There are many of these people, they will have a job, whatever the job may be. But it's often a job that doesn't require really a higher education, it doesn't require creativity. And they just want to keep that job for the rest of their lives. And they want to have this sense of security or comfortability. You go to work every day, you know exactly what's required of you. You can just follow the rules, follow the procedures. And this is what you do. And you do the same thing every day, every day, every day. They don't want to change, they don't want something new. And you often see these people becoming very distraught if they worked for a big company and it closes. And now they have to re-educate themselves, or they have to adapt, so they have to learn a new skill. For example, many people in my parents' generation, they couldn't even conceive of learning how to use a computer. It was just inconceivable. It just couldn't be done. They just gave up without even trying. I know people from my grandparents' generation couldn't conceive of driving a car. You couldn't possibly learn to drive a car. That was too beyond what they had grown up with. So this is what you see in many of these people. They're not very willing to learn something new. They're not very willing to change. And they're not willing to think creatively. They're really not willing to, they want to be told what to do, and they want to know these are the rules. And then they'll do it mechanically, repeat it over and over again, but they don't want something breaking up the routine, or they don't want to have to take responsibility for thinking. You see, often in bureaucracy, you come down to get a new driver's license, and if you haven't filled out the form just right, if you haven't gotten the right picture and this and that, they can't adapt. You have to follow the rules, because they can't go beyond the rules. They can't think beyond the rules. And you see that, over and over and over again. That people are very, very attached to maintaining a routine that they feel safe with and comfortable with. And if they have to go beyond the routine, they feel very uncomfortable, and they can often get aggressive, in wanting to maintain their sense of security and comfortability. And they also have a tendency to want to follow leaders. You see right now in the United States that you have these people. My wife just read a book called Hillbilly Elegy, about a man who grew up in Ohio in the Appalachian Mountains around these people who are, in slang, they're called hillbillies. Because they live in the mountains, they don't want to change anything. And he describes this whole process of what he went through, pulling himself somewhat above this legacy that he was born with. And many of them are people who, when they grew up, there was a certain amount of jobs, mining, logging, whatever it might be. But things have changed. But they can't conceive of re-educating themselves. So now they are on welfare, they don't have good jobs, then they're poor, and they can't really conceive of doing anything to overcome the poverty. But what they do is they become angry, because they somehow feel like society is moving beyond them, they're being left behind, so they become very angry. So they become open to these leaders who fuel their anger and tell them it's not their fault, it's the liberals. In other words, here you have a group of people who won't adapt, but their problems are not caused by the fact that they won't adapt. No, it's caused by all those liberal people who are adapting to changing society. See? And so they become conservative, they become evangelicals, they become Trump supporters, and they're just angry because they're not willing to change. You see in Russia how there are many among the Russian people who don't want to change. That's why they support Putin. You see it in Middle Eastern countries, how they support Islam and even the Sharia law and all this, because they know how everything works. They don't have to change. In other words, you can have a person who is brought up in a certain environment and just wants to live that way that's defined by that environment for the rest of their lives. They don't want to grow. So the way I look at it is that life is an opportunity for growth. In other words, you come into embodiment, you're at a certain level of consciousness. And ideally, when you go out of embodiment after, 70 years, you should have risen higher than the level of consciousness you came in at. But many of these Earth inhabitants, they don't want to do that. They don't look at it that way. They don't even have the concept, and they don't have the willingness to change. So many of them, they just go out of embodiment at the exact same level they came in at. Sometimes they even go lower if they get into negatives such as crime or whatever. But many of them, they're just perfectly happy. I don't see anything wrong with it. I look back again at my family, and it's not to say anything negative about my family. As I said, they were good people, but I just see how my grandparents, for example, they lived in this 2-room apartment. It was in the poorest part of town. They were basically built back in the 30s for poor people. Very low rent. They didn't have a shower. They had a bathroom and a kitchen and then 2 rooms. And they lived there for 40 years. And my grandmother didn't work, my grandfather went to work, and they were happy. This was their life. They couldn't conceive of anything else. They only moved when these buildings were torn down, because it became embarrassing to the town that they still have these buildings. Then they had to move to another apartment, but then they lived there for the rest of their lives. They never had a car. It was like they had a certain level. This was their life. This was what they accepted. And they never strove for anything beyond it. Oh. And so this is very, very characteristic of Earth inhabitants. It can be difficult for us who are avatars to identify with it because we often have that drive, that striving for something. We can get sidetracked into striving for material goals, but it is really the spiritual growth that we desire because we want to grow. We have a sense that there is more. It's possible to grow. And some of these Earth inhabitants, many of them, they just don't have it. Now, some do, because again, you can rise, of course, over lifetimes, and so many have risen to that level where they are also striving to improve their lives. And I see that also in even in my family, because, as I said, my grandparents, they had a certain level of material affluence, or rather poverty, that they accepted that as normal. But my parents' generation, they were at a higher level. And but still, I mean, in my family, I was the first person to get a high school degree. So my entire parents' generation never got a high school degree. They never had it in their minds. They saw themselves as working class people, never had it in their minds that they could get an education. Now, some of them worked their way up in a company, to leadership positions. So they grew from that. But still, it was like they just couldn't imagine going beyond certain boundaries. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that if you look at the Earth inhabitants, the characteristic for most of them is that they have accepted certain boundaries for what life can be. And they either can't conceive of going beyond, or they are very reluctant to conceive of it. And if you force them to consider that they could possibly go beyond these boundaries, they often will either ignore you, or they'll become very aggressive in rejecting you, proving you wrong. And you see this, for example, in these Trump supporters that you can find interviews up on YouTube, where they get interviewed and they become very aggressive in defending that they're absolutely right in the way they look at life. And I've, of course, encountered that myself with other people. I encountered it with my family when I started talking about the spiritual path. And most avatars, most spiritual people have encountered the same.